Minister in the Presidency Khumbudzo Ntshavheni has warned South Africans who are thinking of joining the Israel-Hamas war against doing so. It's after a question asked by the NFP Sheikh Imam in Parliament or the National Assembly yesterday about some South Africans allegedly enlisting to fight as part of the Israeli Defense Force, which is currently carrying out a military operation in the Gaza Strip, where over 10,000 Palestinians have been killed. This followed the killing of 1,400 people by the Palestinian armed group Hamas on the 7th of October. The African Defence Review's Darren Olivier joins us now to talk more about the warning from government. Darren, a very good evening to you. Good to have you on News at Prime. So perhaps let's talk about why it is that joining a military such as the IDF in Israel would be against the law if you're a South African citizen.
So technically we do have prohibitions against joining foreign forces. That's really linked to the current laws around joining mercenary outfits. Really, I think part of a government desire back when this was promulgated back in the 90s to avoid its citizens, really embarrassing it on the global stage. However, since put into place, there hasn't been a single case of that being successfully prosecuted. So it's really an issue of this is something that exists on the books, but it's probably unenforceable in its current form. This applies obviously not just to Israel, it applies to any force that a person might be serving in, whether Israeli army, Russian army, British army, it doesn't really matter. It's quite difficult to prevent a citizen from, doing this in a sense, unless you create specifically additional laws for this. So while the warning is I think, one that we see fairly often, this isn't the first time government has said this or demanded this. I think it's an open question as to whether we'll see any real outcomes from this.
With that in mind then, would one of the issues or reasons why this is basically unenforceable, for example, be the fact that once someone is abroad as part of a group of mercenaries or a foreign defense force, getting them here might not be easy if you want them to come face prosecution, for instance?
That is a difficult factor, but even in cases where there have been people who returned to South Africa and been prosecuted, successful prosecutions are very rare. There have been a couple of plea deals and some restrictions on minor aspects of it. But in general, the consensus around this is that the laws are themselves difficult to enforce because of, how hard it is to first of all prove this, and the fact that the laws themselves are not that straightforward in terms of how and whether can bind, and how and when those obviously conflict with the other rights that citizens have to, apply their trade freely elsewhere. So it is, inherently a very thorny and tricky area. I think we'll probably see government try to firm that up over the next few years, 3 months to years. But at the moment, this may just be another, more or less empty warning. That said, though, we might see government try to make an example case out of this. There's always the chance that new case law might be developed, and that would then result in a change. But looking at what's happened so far, there haven't been any that I'm aware of.
And that would take a long time, of course. If anyone has monitored the way the legislative process in this country works, it's not something that would happen, not at the very least, during this latest escalation of violence in Gaza.
No. But, as with any conflict elsewhere in which Africans are involved, whether as mercenaries or joining the armies, the numbers are still fairly low. So we have to question, is this really the highest priority of government? I understand the emotions around it and everything else, and certainly that should be something looked into. But from the point of view of accelerating this, yes.
I want to talk to you about the numbers because at this stage, no one seems to know actually how many South Africans are abroad working as mercenaries or have enlisted with militaries such as the IDF where they're fighting. Today I saw one video of a young man who said to be from South Africa who was saying that he is indeed involved in fighting as part of the Israeli military. And even then there were disputes, for example, about whether or not he was still a South African or had even obtained Israeli citizenship.
Yes. So in that case, that's one of the examples of where it's complicated. Does South Africa have a right to insist that people who become citizens of other countries aren't able to join their militaries? And again, think of this not just for Israel, because this would apply to any country, whether they're joining a European military or anywhere else. We don't have good figures on this because it hasn't really been tracked by anybody that I'm aware of. But the numbers I've seen suggest in definitely the low hundreds in terms of South Africans serving abroad in foreign militaries. I think at the height, the number was probably about, definitely less than 1,000. Mercenary activity was a lot more common, especially at the height of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. In that case, there were, quite a few thousand South Africans serving abroad. But over the last few years, that has also declined quite substantially. So at the moment, I think we're probably speaking about no more than 5,000 of both in total.
What exactly makes it difficult to monitor or keep track of the numbers, Darren?
Well, that would require a level of surveillance on what South Africans are doing abroad. And it would require cooperation from the host countries. You certainly aren't going to have, let's say, the UK, the US, Britain, Russia, India, providing data to South Africa on which South Africans are serving the militaries voluntarily. Some might, but generally it's going to be quite an uphill struggle. On that, on top of that, you then need to be sure that they're involved in a conflict, which requires even more information. So what you are reduced to eventually is policing based on footage that comes out or photographs that come out. And each one of those then requires its own investigation into, well, is the person a dual citizen? Are they not? And so on and so forth. It requires a large amount of personnel time at the inside the SAPS. And I think that's the reason why, so far it hasn't really been policed that strongly, and probably won't be.
And lastly, is there a clear idea, I wonder, any sort of research perhaps that could tell us why it is that South Africans would join a group of mercenaries or enlist as part of a foreign military?
There's been some studies based on the mercenary side of things. Predominantly that's based on people, well, first of all, monetary gain, people with the right set of skills looking to bolster their retirement funds, perhaps. Some looking for a bit of adventure, but that's quite, I think, much rarer. In terms of foreign militaries, that's because people might have gone to a new country to live there, and they might feel that that's one route to becoming citizens, for example, or they might feel that this is one way to become, part of their new home. I think to try to analyze this, it's much easier to analyze why people become mercenaries than it is to analyze why they join foreign militaries.
Darren, Olivier, good to speak to you from the Defence Review, the African Defence Review, that is.